Welcome to the Fire These Times, the podcast bringing you conversations at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I am your host Joey Ayoub, and today we'll be talking to Emmi Bevensee. They are data journalists who utilizes a data storytelling approach to make complexity understandable. Now, go ahead and check out the categories listed in the episode description. You can even pause this for a sec if you want. That's how many things we get into. And this is just part one. So I won't even try to summarize these two episodes. I will only say that if you are interested in understanding complex problems impacting our world today, I hope that you will find these two episodes useful. So that's today's episode. This episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. That's patreon.com/firethesetimes. Or check the website for other methods. If you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tara Beat. Thank you for listening and take care.
So I'm just gonna play banjo for like the first half of the interview, right?
Yes, exactly. That's the point.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so before we even start, Emmi, can you tell us a bit about some of the billion projects you're involved with at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know how I got involved in so many things. 2020 was supposed to be the year that I like cut out all my projects and just focused on one, but instead I still had a lot of things going on. I guess I should start with like, I'm a data scientist. My background is mostly in researching fascist groups and weird forms of fascist creep on the left and stuff like that. But I'm involved in a million things. Like I was helping run this project that we hope to turn into a book about like the role of feelings work in like activist communities. That project is called Emotional Anarchism. I like ran a symposium about decentralization and economic coordination, basically where we were just trying to think about like how different, everybody's like, oh, central planning like in a Stalinist state is bad, but also capitalism is bad, so how do we do economies? And so we had a big conversation about that stuff. And I don't know, I wrote a paper about ecofascism. I just had a really big article where we basically analyzed these email. The people at the center of QAnon is 8chan, now 8kun, and we analyze these like they basically set up their email server wrong and made the logs of everyone they email public. so we just archived it. But then we like did a bunch of data analysis on it and stuff like that. I don't know. I'm all over the place, Joey.
Yeah, so like I was just laughing. I muted myself because I was laughing too much. But like you're basically like me. You have no idea how to summarize what you do. That's basically the conclusion here.
Yeah, I have a Twitter bio that I can read you.
We'll go through them in the chat. It's fine. So like let's just start with one of them. You have a piece entitled, I basically stole the title of it for this episode. Like it takes a network to defeat a network, anti/fascism, and the future of complex warfare. And I think it's upcoming if I'm not mistaken. So like what is it about? Let's just walk us through some of the main arguments and we'll take it from there.
So that article has actually recently split into probably 3 different articles that we're pitching. Like one is for a book and then 2 for 2 different outlets. And so there's going to be some versions of that sooner, I think. And that the premise for that article was basically like me and some friends of mine have been having this thing that's been bothering us for a while, which is that kind of the vast majority of leftist theory has not really been updated with like the advancements of complexity theory or like information theory or just like the modern technically interconnected world, or like cybernetics, or all these things that have happened since the Industrial Revolution. And so we started thinking about like, how could we use these frameworks to create better paths for resistance, and also to make predictions that are grounded in sort of trends, that emergent trends in these spaces, that we think would better serve a wide range of resistance movements. And so we started settling in on a few specific topics that make it easy to show this thing. And one of the first ones we started talking about was like conflict more generally, but also war specifically. And not just like violent warfare, but like hybrid or gray zone warfare, however you want to, like below the threshold of violence, kind of information warfare and stuff like that. Because those fields make it really make this stuff really obvious. So some of the big things that we highlight are that there are emergent trends towards individual super empowerment. And so what we mean by that is like one person can do a lot of damage or make a lot of impact, or a very small cluster of people. And, we first started seeing that when, 8chan was a joke in the old days. It was extremely niche. I tried to pitch articles about it all the time, and people were like, this is way too niche. And then obviously Christchurch, and now we have, QAnoners storming the US Capitol. So there's this way in which like very niche things, because of the internet and the complexity of our like modern system, can have these huge impacts. And that's like the information side of it. And you can have like all these weird disinfo actors, and they can be state backed or they can be grassroots, and they interact in complicated ways. And but then on the warfare side, there's also these like, I'm really interested in 3D printed guns and like drone warfare, not because I'm like excited inherently about the concept, but just because there's a 100% chance that they're going to become an increasingly large part of our future. And so I think that we should understand the like implications of them. And the implications are kind of weird in that they favor asymmetric actors. Like Houthis set up a hobby drone and used it to attack an oil refinery
in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, in Saudi Arabia. So it's like, that's huge. That's like, whatever, not talking about the politics of it at all, just like a non-state actor using a $25 toy, basically, and rigging it to destroy massive infrastructure of one of the like largest states, like most powerful states in the world. And so there's a question of like, historically the AK-47 in some ways really facilitated decolonization of Africa. Like there are serious complicated arguments to be made about that. Obviously, all kinds of other fucked up stuff happened, and guns are guns, but these types of asymmetric developments have really complicated implications for the structure of different forces in conflict with each other. And so we kind of predict that states, as people develop more autonomy and more power, states are gonna like double down on what they can do to stop that. But a lot of this is very hard to stop. Like you could make 3D printers illegal, but you can also make 3D printers, There's only so much you can do to stop any of this. And so, it kind of begs the question about what states are going to do. I think probably adopt like a Chinese surveillance model in some ways. So that stuff's pretty scary. But there's some kind of exciting trends about like the general structure of interconnectedness favoring asymmetric actors, which is that like communities that are already good at working in networks, like anti-authoritarian communities, for example, have kind of an advantage in this terrain in terms of carving out spaces. And so anti-fascists have been pioneering networked. So some of the tactics that I think are interesting are like OSINT, for example, open source intelligence, which is basically just like using information that's available on the internet. It's like really high-tech Googling. Just that's all you need to know about us.
Yeah.
And you know, like anti-fascist communities have kind of pioneered this technique of being like having a small, highly trusted group that's very private and works together, but also utilizing, you know, these huge swarms of people. Those used to be pretty niche techniques, but they've already hugely expanded. So now with the like coup attempt, with the like, you know, B-level coup attempt on the US Capitol, they like, you know, now like liberals are getting in on this tactic. They're not very good at it, actually. They're pretty irresponsible at it. So a lot of anti-fascists are kind of mad about that. But it's become like mainstream understood that we can work in crowds of 10,000 to identify a dude who brought full-on tactical gear to kidnap or whatever, like people in Congress. And so I do have some hope that we have. The other thing is like, ideally, these anti-authoritarian left communities are kind of inherently good at internationalism. Like, I think this like vulgar anti-internationalist tanky movement is a mutation on a lot of the values. We should be acting in solidarity with people instead of states, because their conflicts are nested. They're going to have conflicts with an imperialist over here, and they're going to have local conflicts with power actors there. I think most people understand that, and that comes from us, like, contrary to fascists, like wanting to believe in an open society, to just throw a little Soros buzzword in there. You know, we want.
Yeah, might as well, since like we're gonna be accused of being Soros funded anyway.
Like, we want to believe in empathy. We're not naive, but we want to believe in like, we recognize that our problems are interconnected. So like another example of this kind of weird complexity theory conflict things is like states engage in information warfare, but it's not the Cold War anymore. And there's the internet. And so it's extremely chaos. Like Russia, so there's this outlet called, I don't know how it's pronounced, Katehon, Katehon. I don't actually speak Russian. And it's pretty transparently run by Russian intelligence. But they were propagating a lot of conspiracies about how 5G causes coronavirus and stuff like that. But now Russia has some of the worst infection rates in the world. So obviously, like in the Cold War or something, it would be advantageous for them to like, you know, try to fuck up the United States by getting a lot of us to die in a pandemic or something, when obviously we can do that well on our own.
Yeah, that's.
But now, because of the internet and the complexity area, and also playing fire, like pandemics are the quintessential example of complexity dynamics, because viral spread is a complex phenomena. So now they're fucked by coronavirus too. So, and now there's like QAnon shit, you know? So it's like the information warfare of the old era just is like kind of insanely short-sighted at this point.
Yeah, I whenever I watch one of those old spy movies, it's, you know, by modern standards, or like with the sort of technology that we have now, you could guess who the spy is within like 5 minutes into the movie, and it doesn't the plot doesn't really work anymore, and it's incredible. I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, I think you already know this, obviously, like the disinformation problem. I've had both Elliot Higgins on and Peter Pomerantsev on, and a few other folks who usually either focus on Russia/Ukraine, or they focus on Syria, sometimes both, but not as many. I will say there's been a lot of missed opportunity between Ukrainians and Syrians to actually link up at some point. There was quite a lot of attention on both countries for, unfortunately, the similar reason, namely the Kremlin's involvement. But yeah, I mean, I'll try and maybe do an episode on that. But so like you mentioned the 8kun, 8chan shit that's been happening recently, especially since the coup, and you've recently published a scoop on Bellingcat, speaking of Elliot Higgins, on Bellingcat and the role of 8kun in the coup attempt. So for those, let's try and be kind to the listeners.
Yeah.
Because those are very niche within, or they used to be anyway, back in the good old days. Very niche sections of the internet where very weird shit happens. And if we are also to be extra nice, if that's okay for those who have been living under Iraq, can you sort of give your own take, or at least summarize what the fuck happened on January the 6th in the first place? The online dynamic of it anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe this should have been my bio at the beginning when you asked me what I'm up to.
Yeah.
I'm a data journalist. I like to scrape far right websites and then analyze what they're up to, and then just publish articles about them, which seems to make them mad for some reason.
For some reason.
And so I've had beef. I've been paying attention to 8chan for a long time, and the Chan world for a long time. And
so that's like 4chan first, and then 8chan.
Yeah. So we had this whole Gamergate thing, and the Gamergate thing is kind of an example of where this complex swarm tactics kind of emerged on the right. The right was like, we can have these anonymous image boards. They're just forums where you post a picture and then say a racist thing, and then everybody says you're doing a good job. And we can have these, and we can coordinate large-scale doxing and harassment, campaigns against female journalists or like female gamers and stuff like that. Wow, I just said the word female. That came out of my mouth. And so they kind of found their power, and that's basically how the alt-right started. And then 4chan slightly cracked down on the most genocide-prone aspects of their user base, like the most hardcore neo-Nazi LARPers. And so those people moved to this platform called 8chan, and 8chan was like the super racist version of the racist site. And they were brutal in the way that they would attack people. So a lot of us that were active in those scenes developed a very thick skin for their style of attacking you. I won't go into that because it's just depressing, but so 8chan was run by this pig farmer in the Philippines named Jim Watkins, who got his start running child sexual abuse websites and trying to circumvent Japanese pornography laws using these image boards.
And which is amazingly ironic for QAnon to then develop on that, given their supposed obsession with,
save children,
hating pedophiles and whatever. And yeah. Anyway, sorry, continue.
They're like, yes, let's get all the virtue signal points of hating child sexual abusers, but then let's also support them because we stand for nothing. We're QAnon. The storm is coming. So Jim's a creep. He's like cartoonishly evil. He's like too on the nose. He's like Eric Prince of Blackwater. You're just like, dude, this character is not believable. He's too evil to be real.
You literally couldn't write it in an actual movie because you need more nuance in movies most of the time.
I need some redeemable characteristics here. You just kind of boggles the mind of like, how do you become this person? But he has a son named Ron Watkins, and they became the center of QAnon. Like, because Q drops, well, they used to happen on 4chan, but they started happening on 8chan. And there's a lot of arguments about whether Jim or Ron or both are even Q themselves or whatever. And I got blocked by Jim Watkins a while ago for asking about inconsistencies in this verification system that they have for the Q drops called trip codes. And he just blocked me for asking about that. So, but yeah, so they, aside from inspiring multiple mass shootings by being this concentrated force for hardcore white supremacy and like these swarm tactics, they also became the center of QAnon because they were hosting the Q drops. And QAnon obviously built the energy, the like tsunami for everything that came to happen with like, Stop the Steal and ultimately the March on the Capitol and stuff like that. Does that cover the basics of the story?
For those who don't know, what exactly are swarm tactics? What happens when they do that?
Yeah, so anti-fascists and fascists do this tactic differently, but there are some similarities. Like, arguably, in my mind, not arguably, like consistently, fascists have like no like ethics of warfare equivalent. They're just like, I'll dox your grandma. I'll like call your child's school. I'll like, they're just trolls. They come out of the worst part of old anonymous culture. And so they're just like, they want to be maximally edgy and they don't really stand for anything. And whereas like anti-fascists tend to be try to be careful and like more like don't do civilian casualty equivalents and stuff like that. And if they do, they get seriously like harassed by the community. They get blacklisted basically. But basically the swarm tactics aspect of it is trying to use the internet to leverage tons of people acting at the same time for a common purpose. And so like swarming over a topic, like, and there are some real advantages to having large numbers. Like, someone will just recognize their neighbor from the, Capitol breach or whatever.
Yeah.
Or just like, I watched this one story, it was like BBC Eye or something like that, and they were trying to find this mountain range somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, I think in the Great Lakes region, and like they were like, in Google Earth all the time trying to find this mountain range, and then finally someone was like, yo, isn't that like right in this spot by where my friend's village is, and like tags their friend, and their friend was like, oh yeah, I know that mountain. So there's like some advantages to having just like a huge number of eyes on a problem, because you can cover more ground, especially if you're working in a semi-coordinated way. Like, and so it's very powerful, because like if you've tried to do OSINT research alone, there are things that are better to do alone or in a small group. But the hardest part about it is that you have so much information to go through that it's just really hard to parse without your brain just like melting out of your ears. So that's kind of the advantage of these swarm tactics, but there's a lot of different forms of it. This is just like, like fascists also like to do like block trains, or not block trains, like brigading. So they'll have like a Telegram group where they'll be like, okay, this anti-fascist account is getting too effective. I want everyone in this Telegram channel to go report them. And so try to get that person's Twitter removed or something like that. So it's like, yeah, it's like hard, yeah.
Amazingly similar to just, pro-government trolls in the Arab world. That happens quite a lot as well. And they seem to
Yeah.
be just as organized often, or they mix in with bots, and sometimes it's difficult to tell them apart, to be honest. But yeah.
And yeah, there's maybe also some parallel with like Shabbiha organizations, like the way that you can kind of leverage paramilitary forces in like a hands-on, hands-off kind of way, to like do your bidding. It also happens in Latin America a lot. Like whenever the Mexican government wants to attack the Zapatista autonomous zones, they can't do it legally with the Mexican army. So they have to use these very patriotically named paramilitary groups. Yeah, it's kind of like that because it's just like, or it's like Donald Trump, he's just like, yeah, I don't hate the Proud Boys. It sure wouldn't be too bad if they like beat up all of my political rivals. That would be kind of funny. But anyways, don't do it.
There's a lot of like affect in the way he does things, and I feel like that's probably an episode in itself. Like, how in the middle of the attempted coup, he would say things like, what did he say? Like, you're very special. I care about you. Whatever it is. That's some like very like cult 101 shit. Like, this is really, I've seen this in Lebanon with like Hezbollah crap. This is not. Yeah, it was very familiar and very weird to see it just like on my timeline at the time. But yeah, that's a different story.
Yeah. So there's aspects of that where you can like a centralized actor can leverage a swarm. Like a swarm can have grassroots dynamics, or it can be manipulated by like a state's warfare. So like in my opinion, there's very probably state actor involvement at high levels in like QAnon. Or I would be embarrassed by the Kremlin if there wasn't. Like it would be, like the US does this shit everywhere, all over the world. The Kremlin does this shit everywhere, all over the world. They're all incompetent, but they're all also very powerful. So, I'd be shocked if there wasn't some involvement. But swarms are complicated. Like states can't control them. They're not like, a vanguard can't. You can't control the entire QAnon movement. It's way too big. It's way too chaotic. You can do a Q drop, but then people will be like, even if it gets too weird in your Q drop, people will, just be like, come up with a new conspiracy. So yeah, that's kind of so anyways, we had this big scoop with 8kun where they didn't update their email server for like 5 years, and it made everyone that they were emailing visible, and their emails were pretty interesting. So Ron Watkins is Jim's son. Sorry, I'm bouncing around on this.
It makes sense.
Ron
It's a complicated network anyway, so I just assume that our conversation is gonna be like that as well.
Yeah. So Ron Watkins is Jim Watkins' son, and Ron Watkins was the admin. He stepped down from being admin to grift full time on Stop the Steal. He's basically largely responsible for the Dominion conspiracy. He was cited in the Kraken brief by Sidney Powell, and he was cited and retweeted extensively by Donald Trump, and he went on OANN and stuff like that. So he got a really, really powerful grift going for Stop the Steal. But he was admin of 8kun and 8chan previously during all this other shit. And so we also got all of his emails. It's probably his fault. Like he was saying, oh, I'm a network security analyst. I'm the best in the world. And then he had this email server that was like exposing all of their traffic and their IP addresses, by the way, like, and the entire structure of their databases and everything else on their fucking website. So there was really interesting email contacts. Jim was like actively coordinating with high level QAnon celebrities like Neon Revolt. So that kind of shows that they were actively involved in the QAnon phenomena. Jim was also extensively emailing this woman who is a senior contract specialist at a U.S. Army base in Alabama. We can't know the exact content of their messages, but we can know that she's the one he emailed most. Not that I think that she's Q, I don't. I think she's like a really weird conspiracy boomer, like maybe his e-girlfriend or something. But it's still really wild that he was like connecting her with all these QAnon celebrities and talking with her so much. And she probably has some classification or some clearance level, at least secret. Yeah, we sent Jim and Ron right a reply, of course. Ron did not respond. Jim responded 6 times. And one of the funny things that he responded about was he was like, it's not like I was emailing the FBI, which I think is like a message to his QAnon followers, like, don't worry, I'm not in the deep state. But what was funny about the email logs is he literally was emailing the FBI.
It's incredible. Like at what point would the people behind the conspiracies, or at least the people who are like high level influencers, so to speak, within the conspiracies, at what point would the masses, whatever you want to call them, most people, most QAnoners or whatever they're called, at what point would they turn on them? And if it ends up being this, and this is kind of a side question in some ways, but as you mentioned before, like there's no actual way of controlling these things. There are ways of slowing it down, and maybe we can get into this, or de-radicalizing people and those kind of tactics. I know they exist. And I mean, I will also say, I think it is important to mention that, people can be changed on these things. Not everyone probably, but like a lot of them. Bring all of that aside, what happens when the people that believe the numbers behind the movement turn on the ones that are its main influencers? Like at what point do they just create a post-QAnon thing or whatever it is?
I think that because they're QAnon is a cult in my mind, but it's a different type of cult because it's much more decentralized than cults that we're used to.
Yeah.
Like there are Q drops, which is this point of centralization, but the Q drops, if you ever read them, they're more vague than like astrology readings. They're extremely vague. They're like, well, the wave, watch the waters, Q, and then so everyone's like, oh, this must be about watermarks on ballots. You know what I mean? And then they like retroactively make a whole mythos about it. But it's just bullshit. And it's just like cold reading. And so because it's like a decentralized cult, I think it's much harder to control. But it's also much more adaptive because like people can justify anything that happens. They did turn on Pence. I mean, they were all like, we have to hang Pence or whatever. And in our Parler data, that's like an QAnon 8chan kind of thing, 8kun thing. But then in our data that we have from Parler before it shut down, we find tons of people who are like talking about trying to kidnap Pence or whatever, So it can turn on people, but also it can just morph. Like, I think that I think that there is going to be some critical mass of people who fall off once Biden becomes president or whatever, and Trump doesn't do some last ditch, epic battle against the deep state or whatever. I think a lot of people
Yeah, sorry, you probably were going to say.
Yeah, no, go on.
Yeah. And like a lot of them are expecting that something like that would happen. They're actually, I have read some of them, and I follow it as much as my mental health can afford. They do seem to, like, the image that they have of Donald Trump is not Donald Trump. It's absolutely not the person. It's not the dude. Like it's such a much more impressive human being or creature, whatever, than the figure of the person of Donald Trump. It's very obvious if you're not obviously within the cult. But then what happens when reality hits, I mean, a lot of them have sort of gone into this like very, very deeply, and they've cut off ties with their own family members, and there are very, very depressing stories that have come out of this in the UK as well. There was a BBC podcast, I think, of this woman who's one of the leaders in the UK of QAnon, and her son has been so disaffected by her that he doesn't even consider her his mother anymore. So there are these, and there have been like horrifying like deaths and suicides and all of these things that have also happened. But like, yeah. So my question was, it doesn't really have an answer, I suppose. I'm also just kind of thinking out loud on this because if there are various, like, we use the cult sometimes, the word cult, sorry, like a bit haphazardly. I do agree in this case that it's definitely a cult, but I also call Hezbollah a cult, and in many ways it is, but it's also much more centralized, and there is a logic to what they do, at least an internal logic to what they do. Obviously not a good one, but like any kind of movement, extremist movement, cults, whatever you want to call them, at various parts of that like spectrum, there is an internal logic, and they won't kind of turn on the dear leader. Hassan Nasrallah, he's sacrosanct, and he's not gonna. They never insult him. He's not someone who they can, hang Mike Pence kind of situation. But they can go against those that are like lower ranks. They might say that the party is corrupt, but not him, or like the other MPs are corrupt, but not him. And so there's always this but that in itself allows a bit more flexibility. You can talk to most of, not all of them, and I've tried and I've failed many times, but you can talk to a lot of them. With QAnoners, it's that, I mean, many of them you can talk, and there's this podcast by Jake Hanrahan on QAnon as well. People can check that out. I've listened to a few of them, and he did interview someone who at that stage was sort of like becoming a bit skeptical of QAnon, but was still within that world. And so you can talk to them, and many of them, mean well, or are seriously misinformed, or they've been brainwashed, or
like the deep state is pretty fucked up, like if these guys were just doing critiques of the CIA and the FBI, like there's plenty of long left history, that they could have dove into and capitalized upon. Like there's plenty of valid things to critique. It's not like I liked the deep state. But it's just, there's something different about, there's something different about, like, I think the FBI is bad because they do bad things, and I think the FBI is zealous sycophants. Like it's a slight distinction, but I think an important one.
Well, I mean, this is a perfect transition, because I wanted to, I know based on previous episodes and, some listeners that have given me some feedback and whatever, that there definitely seems to be a lot of awareness when it comes to like how fascism develops and how it takes over. But one aspect of it, and it's something that I've myself been very bad at explaining, because it's been vague in my mind for a long time, is how they can actually very comfortably live within very left-wing circles as well, like the syncretic nature of fascism and the entryist forms of it. What's your understanding of how this functions? Because I know that, for example, you have focused on, usually I don't mention them, but because it's relevant to this conversation, like gray zone and that sort of shit, it appeals to a lot of people that I would describe as sort of like tanky light, right? Like they're not, and that's on the quote unquote the left, and obviously there's the right wing equivalent of that, the far right. They're not necessarily like, they wouldn't go read like Stalin's autobiography or whatever the fuck he used to write. It's not that kind of dedication, but
yeah,
it does revolve around the same kind of very binary sort of logic and very binary sort of thinking and whatever, campism essentially. And like the episode that I recorded just before this one, so it will come out a week before this comes out, it was with Rohini Hensman, and she wrote this book called Indefensible, about how the rhetoric of anti-imperialism is so easily used by people that I myself would describe as alt-imperialists or pseudo-anti-imperialists or whatever other terms people have used. Leila Shami
Or
just
straight
calls
up
them.
neo-Nazis.
Sorry?
Or straight up neo-Nazis also
Yeah,
use the language
absolutely.
of
Absolutely.
anti-imperialism.
Absolutely, and it's one of the arguments that I've made in terms of there is such a thing as fascist anti-imperialism. It does exist, and so being anti-imperialist in itself does not make you progressive or anti-authoritarian or whatever. But anyway, like all of this to say that if you're talking to someone who doesn't really understand why, quote unquote, like, okay, I'll try and give a semi-concrete example. Why someone who is good on domestic issues in the US can be so horrifically bad on anything that's not related to the US. Like they just they go to the other extreme and they become completely identical from my standpoint to like someone on the far right. How would you understand that phenomenon? And in your view, like what are some of the similarities between this and what we would then understand as like entryism and, you know, the syncretic nature of fascism? And if you can also kind of define them briefly for those who don't know as well.
Yeah, okay. So obviously this is 8 books of topics.
Yeah.
And it's very complex and there's a lot of dynamics at play. So take anything I say right now as an invitation or as a set of questions rather than as the final word on this. And also, even just with myself, I have my views on these issues, but I encourage people to just destroy my views and challenge them and complexify them and make them into better, stronger things that are more accurate. So I think there's a few big dynamics at play. So I'll just say like a context about the US. I think a lot of this shit comes from the US and the UK particularly, but obviously it's in other places. And for us, I think as particularly my generation, we grew up, everyone in the world knew that the US and the UK lied about weapons of mass destruction in order to invade Iraq. So we grew up with like this very visceral understanding that our government lies to everyone in order to justify war. And that was like, that became the cornerstone of like boomer socialist organizing, anti-war organizing in particular. So in the US, there's like old anti-war infrastructure organizations like Answer Coalition, which are horrible on Syria. They're like kind of indistinguishable from the SSNP at points.
And the Stop the War movement in the UK as well.
And they really mingle with hardcore anti-Semitic organizations. And I'm absolutely not critiquing, or I'm not conflating critiques of Israel with anti-Semitism. I'm talking about actually anti-Semitic organizations. And they control a lot of infrastructure in the US. And so whenever there's like a call to war, they're often able to mobilize like a bunch of old white socialists and like get a few people on the streets. They have tons of signs printed and stuff like that. And so they're kind of like, there's kind of like this sense of, if we challenge them, then you're pro-war or whatever. But like, Joey, these people are so ridiculous. Like where I live, there's a huge Syrian population. A lot of these people are from Aleppo and are from East Aleppo. And our anti-war like left boomers wanted to welcome these people and go show their support to them. So they bought regime flags. They bought the regime flags to welcome Syrian refugees of burial bombings. Like they're just so they have no concept of people's like lived realities in these and traumas and the geopolitics. It's like even if you have some critique of like, you know, Islamic fundamentalism or something like that, you don't bring the flag of someone who just barrel bombed people to those refugees. Like, it's just like wildly inconsiderate and re-traumatizing. And so that kind of stuff is pretty common. Like when I came, so I used to work, I used to live and work on the Syrian border on the Turkish side for like a year, but I was also working with Syrians for like 2 or 3 years in total in that kind of dedicated way. And so when I came back to the US and I met all my old, like a lot of my leftist friends, even good faith ones who aren't tankies, they're like anarchists, because of the infrastructure that these tanky lights hold, not just on the streets, but also in media organizations, there was just a very extreme form of disinformation, to the point where I would like get in physical confrontations with people at demos and stuff like that, because I would just be like, what the fuck are you talking about? You know, like, because I have all of these people's stories in my, like, there's the types of things that are not even questions of debate amongst Syrians. Like the Overton window is so far from the actual things that are considered questions among Syrians that it was just like baffling to me. It was like being gaslit in this really intense way. And I'm white, you know, like my trauma is vicarious. It's nothing compared to the people whose stories I heard, but like still it was just so baffling to me. And so that was kind of how I started getting interested in this phenomena. And so I mentioned there's like this question of old infrastructure and the Iraq War and not updating, and also just like the complexities of like, how do you parse information when it's coming from somewhere that you don't live and you don't understand the culture? And meanwhile, you're getting spoon-fed like really elaborate disinformation operations from a state-backed actor, multiple state actors. It's pretty hard. I'll give sympathy that it's like, it's hard to know what's going on. You know, like when I first started making friends with more people from Hong Kong, I couldn't quite get a sense of what was going on until I had more friends and there was more media outlets that I ran into and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So
same
I'm
for me.
sympathetic. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that for sure. But there's like a fundamentalism to the way it works, at least in the West, where yeah, like I can't organize with a lot of the socialists here, unfortunately, because their politics are so bad on the Middle East that I can't like even be around them. They're like, we need to stage a vigil for Soleimani. You know, I'm just like, but why though?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Have you ever considered not? um, and so, okay, there's that level. Then the other level, and something that I wanted to kind of talk to you about, is there's some tension of populism. So there's like the you know, the Duginist view of like pure red brown, like red brown meaning like, you know, leftist aesthetics and fascist politics usually blended together.
Do you
Sometimes
explain? Do you explain
what's that?
Do you explain who Jugin is for those who are happy right
Yeah,
now and don't know who he is?
Dugin is like this wacky Russian philosopher, but he has held some degree of power in the Russian state at various times. He was very influential in the Russian military, like with Gerasimov, who was like the chief of staff for the Russian military or whatever. Like was very influential with him, but he's kind of also viewed as a wacky figure, and like he's kind of losing influence to like the pure Russian nationalist chauvinists. But he has this view of basically a hard left and far right populist alliance against liberalism. And most people would not get behind, most leftists would not get behind something like that when it's stated that clearly. Like if I was like, hey, liberalism is bad, right? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, so you want to ally with neo-Nazis about it? They'd be like, wait, what?
Yeah.
But most reasonable people, although a lot of people just straight up are about it now, it's becoming more and more of a thing. There are all these conferences and stuff. Like, you know, I might get canceled for this, but like a lot of figures on the left, like a lot of the gray zone periphery people, but also people like Ajamu Baraka, who, you know, was vice president candidate for the Green Party and is like,
and who visited Damascus.
yeah, who went on junket tours, and he went twice to this conference. He was a speaker in this conference in Iran, and it's just like an explicitly red-brown conference, like tanky out and out tanky spies who work with Syrian and Russian intelligence, alongside like this dude who was involved in a false flag bombing of a Hungarian like cultural center for the AfD, which is like this fascist political party in Germany. So all these people, just like David Duke went to this conference one time. A bunch of Code Pink people went one time, but like Medea Benjamin said, and Gareth Porter said that it was a mistake. And Pepe Escobar said it was a mistake too. He was like, I had no idea. But then he kept going back every year after that. So yeah, there are people who are explicitly doing this thing. But then in the more reasonable spectrum, there's just like diluted forms of it that happen. And that just is like a product of shared goals. Like there are a lot of people who think Israel is bad, and not all of those people have the same politics. Suffice to say, a lot of people think liberalism is bad, and those people can have really, really different politics than each other. And so if you want to build, so there's this idea of like in left culture of like, we need to build a big movement with as many people as possible. And in order to do that, we have to have populist rhetoric. And like anti-fascists in the Antifa or whatever used to be very unpopular in the US because they were always critical of this kind of populism. They would make very controversial statements, like in the Cascadia movement in the Pacific Northwest in the US. There was this conference at one point, and there was this like indigenous speaker who was going to speak there, and Rose City Antifa was like, no, you guys cannot have this speaker. And everybody was like, what are you talking about? This dude's indigenous. Like, how can you, some like cluster of shadowy figures, say that we can't have the speaker? And they're like, well, that guy explicitly allies with neo-traditionalist revisionism. That's hugely anti-queer, and like, you know, he makes speaking tours with neo-Nazi circles because he wants to build this like patchwork nationalism. And like, I don't think that you guys should ally with this person. And things like that were really, really, really controversial at the time. But I think now a lot of the world has seen what plays out when you allow your movement to ally with the far right. Your movement just gets destroyed, because just because you share one goal doesn't mean you share any values. And so it's like, it's seen as very practical, but it's not practical at all. It's like sabotage.
Yeah, I sort of have like two different questions that are not directly related. So I'll ask the first one, like just to go back a bit to Syria. I don't know, you know, you can share as much as you want on this, but like, can you talk a bit about your time on the border, on the Syrian-Turkish border, and how that sort of informed your own view of, let's say, Syria-related politics? and especially the sort of narratives that once upon a time I used to really obsess about, the tankies and those guys, when it comes to their influences, especially in America and in the UK, and the de facto influence that means on the rest of the world. And do you see any differences between your own politics before that trip, or even, I don't know when that started really, but a before and after sort of thing? Do you see any contrasts there that you think are, worth pointing out?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in I guess I was always somewhat anarchist, maybe more than somewhat. And but all my mentors were mostly old school POC socialists, and had a pretty I was really, really into post-colonial theory and subaltern theory. And I grew up in the Iraq War era too. So I held a lot of those same views, but I basically was I believed, okay, I have to be careful about how I say this.
Yeah, I mean, I do sympathize, because whatever you can say can be taken in very wrong ways. So take your time on this.
So obviously the US is this horrifying actor in international politics. However, I think that when I was younger, I had this overly simple view of the enemies of the US and the internal struggles that people have in other places. And so one of the most challenging things for me, once I started having really robust Syrian community, is people being we want a no-fly zone. Everyone that I knew wanted a no-fly zone. Literally no Syrian that I knew thought that that was a bad idea. And, and I'm oh, well, don't you know, don't you know that the US is imperialist? If you get our boots on the ground, it's game over. And they're like, are you fucking kidding me, bitch? Yes, we know. I had a bunch of Iraqi friends too. They're like, yes, we know. But you need to understand what Russia is doing and what Russia is going to do, and what's actually happening in this situation. There are no beautiful, clear-cut choices that we have here. None of these people were stupid. None of them lacked an anti-imperialist understanding of the world. It was it's in their experience, It's in their familial memory. It's not some abstract theoretical thing like my, USENS. So actually my anti-imperialism was a form of chauvinism, was a form of paternalism. And that was confusing for me to deal with.
Yeah.
To have these smart, and I'm not talking just about liberals, I'm talking about hardcore Marxists and anarchists and, a wide range of people, friends I had who were, Marxist Leninist revolutionaries, but were anti-Assadists and were tortured, So yeah, so that really changed my perspective a lot. But I think the other thing that really impacted me was, I got really into open border work. So yeah, so now I live in the US-Mexico border, and definitely the lessons I learned from the Syrian refugee crisis, and what we would call hospitality here. We call it yeah. There's a lot of felonies around this topic, so I'm just gonna leave it alone. But yeah, so I learned a lot about hospitality culture. I think also Syria is what got me into anti-fascism. Because the reason I started working with Syrians, like probably there's weird white people stuff in there, but from my heart of heart, like I just honestly believe that our struggles were interconnected, and that like I needed to follow the leadership of the Arab Spring because they were pioneering new technologies of revolt and rebuilding their societies. It was a very exciting time, you know? And so, and I believed that however different Syria and the US are, that there was a lot of similarities. Like we have, you know, complex religious issues in a similar way. We have like paramilitary issues. We have, you know, gender and rural, city side. And, you know, we have a lot of similar like deep structures. And so my sense was that I could learn something, and possibly contribute some skills. And so one of the things that I wasn't necessarily thinking about at that time, but became really clear to me, was how fascists can coup good faith social movements. And that like, you know, a lot of my friends were very brave, but they weren't like people who had fought in multiple wars. You know, they were very powerful organizers, but when groups came who had like huge amounts of war experience, they were able to like take over their village or something just because they could protect it better. And so I realized like, oh, that's how fast it happens, you know? And I felt that that was a lesson that I needed to learn about the US as well. And so I got really interested in anti-fascism from that. And, you know, by the time I came back to the US, it was like 2015. So I was kind of there during the height of the refugee crisis. And I came back to the US, and at that point I was already studying like fascist currents in the US. And I was like, oh, this is going to happen here. Like, it's not going to be the same because we have stronger institutions in the US for one. We have civil society, and like we're a capitalist imperialist country. Like there's some obvious differences, but I was like, oh, this is happening. This thing I saw, this thing that my friend told me stories about is happening. So that's how I got into like anti-fascist research and why I became concerned about entryism. I've never talked to I never talked to anyone about this because people don't really understand.
I mean, I unfortunately do. I moved to the, you know, I already mentioned this, so if listeners are gonna get bored, you can, you know, skip like 5 minutes or something. I moved to the UK in 2015, and from Lebanon, obviously, and between 2015 and 2016 is when I really started getting more active in Syria stuff than I was before. Before, when I was still in Lebanon, it was just largely just around the Arab Spring first, and then like just supporting refugee rights and a very low level. I didn't really do anything that impressive. And in 2015, 2016 is when I started noticing, especially on Facebook at the time, I was very active on Facebook before deleting it, which I highly recommend everyone do, by the way. Anyone's listening, just delete it. And in 2015, 2016 is when I started seeing stuff like, you know, obviously this is in the you know, in the year before the fall of Aleppo. So there was a lot of intensification of conflict, even more barrel bombs, even more chemical warfare and all of that. And at the same time, I started seeing a very obvious, I mean, it was very obvious to me, but I didn't really know what to do about it because it felt like, you know, you had access to the secret that was also very open of how a lot of the far right shit was being just replicated on the left, and they were actually identical. And I developed this obsession with tracking, which I should have done a just better job at documenting it in retrospect, of like who would go to Damascus in terms of like Westerners and foreigners on the invitation of you know, Bashar al-Assad, of the regime. And it was like 70% of them would be on the far right, and then 30% would be on the quote unquote left or whatever. Like Ajam Mubarakat is one of them that you mentioned, and many others, including those whose name I shall not mention.
Yeah.
And I wrote this piece at the time. I don't remember where I published it, but it was like on the Stop the War movement in the UK. And for those who don't know, like it's as the name suggests, it came out after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and in the months preceding it as well. And one of their guys, secretary something of something, published an article against the no-fly zone in Syria, which was barely being discussed anyway in the UK. It was never going to happen. But like they wrote this article, and in it, it's just this amazing sentence that I quoted. Is like, if you support the no-fly zone or something, ask Libyans about it. And the problem is that in that piece, there was no Libyans being quoted. And all of the Libyans that have been asked and the polls that have been done on these things, it's pretty clear. Like a lot of them would be like, sort of like, well, it's not our first option. That was in the context of Gaddafi, obviously. That's not our like first option, but there were no other options. Yeah. And indeed, a majority did somewhat support it, if not like happily, but like, with some kind of lukewarm response. And that's like miles away from this sort of reaction that I used to see. Like there were actual protests on the streets of London and other smaller parts of the UK, but especially in London, with these ready-made signs by the Stop the War movement. For those who know, they're very, very visible, very obvious. And you would see these signs for almost anything, like to go back to the established infrastructure that you mentioned before. Like there could be a, stop student tuition hikes, whatever. And then you would see these signs by the Stop the War movement. And so they have their resources essentially. But then there were, and that's kind of a obvious point to make here, but there were no similar, not even a fraction of those protests when it came to actual barrel bombs. And there were proposals at the UK Parliament at the time to even just have like, not even a no-fly zone, but just like drop food over besieged cities. And even that got no real support on the British left, like nothing whatsoever. And whenever I would go to like protests against Bashar al-Assad or whatever, then you will have like 95% of the people there being Syrians. And then you see these protests by the Stop the War movement, and there's like 1 or 2 Syrians, and that's about it. And you're more likely to see, before, I think it was banned at some point by the UK Parliament, but you were more likely to see at the time a flag of Hezbollah and that sort of thing. And there was, and I'll mention this as a sort of anecdote, but just to kind of drive that point home, there was a protest in London in 2015, I think, or early 2016 or whatever. And it was about Syria, although I can't remember what. And I went there with a Palestinian friend, and there was this guy who had this Hezbollah flag in the middle of the protest. He was the only one. And we went up to him, assuming that he was an Arab. Like I just assumed that it was a I don't know, some Lebanese weirdo or something, because they do exist, they're everywhere. And I got really pissed. I yelled at him. It was
okay.
It was not a white guy. It was this. I think Pakistani from the accent that he but he was given the flag by this random Lebanese guy and told to wave it. And he did it because he thought that this was the anti-imperialist thing to do, and he genuinely meant well, and he had no fucking idea what Hezbollah was and what they did, and he didn't even know they were in Syria. He had no idea. And then the Lebanese guy came, the other guy, and the Lebanese guy just basically dismissed me and this Palestinian friend as being imperialist, and the usual crap. And so all of this to say that it's extremely complex, and it gets even more complex when you start entering into these subcategories of identities and whatever. There was this piece at some point, I don't even remember if it was good, but I think it was interesting, of like, there is this phenomenon of queer POCs on the internet being like super tankies about things and whatever. Like, they do exist, and they tend to have a disproportionate impact, probably due to other dynamics. Hey folks, apologies for the awkward break here. We didn't actually know that this was going to be 2 parts. We just continued talking and talking and talking. So I'm cutting the conversation here. I know it is a bit awkward, as I said, so apologies for that again. But part 2 will be available next weekend. Thank you for listening. Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.